4 men shouldn't be able to stop an army. That's what every reasonable person would tell you. 4 cowboys with worn-out rifles and dwindling ammunition, facing down 60 hardened outlaws in the unforgiving terrain of the Black Mountains, should have been dead men within the hour. But sometimes reason doesn't account for desperation, for loyalty, or for the kind of stubborn courage that refuses to accept the inevitable. What happened in those mountains in the autumn of 1873 defied every tactical principle, every calculation of odds, and every prediction made by those who heard the story later. This is the account of how 4 ordinary men became legends, not through seeking glory, but through refusing to abandon what they'd sworn to protect. The story begins not in violence, but in the quiet routine of ranch work that defined life on the frontier. And speaking of beginnings, I'm curious where you're watching this from today. The stories from the Old West seem to resonate with people from all corners of the world, and I always find it fascinating to know where my audience is joining me from. Drop a comment and let me know what part of the world you're experiencing this tale from. The McAllister Ranch sat in a valley on the eastern slope of the Black Mountains, a range that earned its name from the dark pine forests covering its peaks like a mourning shroud. Thomas McAllister had built his operation over 15 years, transforming raw wilderness into productive cattle country through backbreaking labor and iron determination. By the fall of 1873, his ranch employed 12 hands and ran nearly 2,000 head of cattle across, grazing lands that stretched for miles in every direction. 4 of those hands would write their names into frontier history, though none of them sought such recognition. Wade Garrison was the oldest at 42, a former cavalry scout who'd seen combat in the war and decided afterward that he'd had enough of organized violence. He drifted west looking for peace, finding instead the hard work and simple camaraderie of ranch life. Wade stood just under 6 feet, his frame lean and weathered like old leather, with gray threading through his dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. He moved with the economy of motion that came from years of living where wasted energy could mean death. James McCord was 36, a Tennessee man who'd left his home state after Reconstruction, turned it into something he no longer recognized. He stood shorter than Wade, but built wider, with shoulders that came from years of physical labor and hands that could gentle a frightened horse or break a man's jaw with equal efficiency. James had a quick smile and an easy manner that made him popular among the other hands, but those who knew him well understood that beneath the affable exterior lay a core of tempered steel. The third man was Miguel Santos, 28 years old and born in Mexico before crossing north to find work in the territories. Miguel possessed the kind of good looks that turned heads in every town they visited, with dark eyes and a ready laugh that made people instinctively trust him. But he was also the best shot on the ranch, a skill he developed hunting in the mountains around his childhood home. Miguel could put 3 bullets through the same hole at 100 yards, and he'd proven it enough times that even the skeptics had to acknowledge his talent. The youngest was Daniel Curtis, just 23, but already carrying himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd found his place in the world. Daniel had grown up on a failing farm in Kansas, watching his father work himself to death, trying to coax crops from soil that had given up years earlier. When the farm finally went under, Daniel headed west with nothing but a worn saddle and a determination never to fail at anything again. He stood tall and slim, with sandy hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to see further than they should. These 4 men formed the backbone of the McAllister operation, trusted by Thomas with responsibilities that went beyond simple cattle work. When problems arose, whether dealing with difficult animals, repairing critical equipment, or handling disputes with neighboring ranches, Thomas turned to these 4. They'd proven themselves reliable, resourceful, and loyal in ways that transcended simple employment. They were, in the peculiar language of the frontier, good men to ride the river with. The autumn of 1873 brought unusual weather to the Black Mountains. September had been unseasonably warm, with temperatures climbing into the high 80s, even at elevation. The grass stayed green longer than normal, and the cattle fattened on feed that should have been browning by then. It seemed like a blessing, this extended growing season that would mean healthier stock going into winter. But the warmth also meant something else. It meant that the high passes stayed open longer, allowing movement through terrain that would normally be impassable by October. The Kellerman gang had been operating in Colorado and New Mexico for 3 years, leaving a trail of burned homesteads, empty bank vaults, and terrified communities in their wake. Led by Clayton Kellerman, a former Confederate guerrilla who'd never quite accepted that the war had ended, the gang had grown from a handful of bitter veterans into an organized force of 60 men. They weren't simple outlaws grabbing what they could and running. They were something more dangerous, a military unit that happened to rob and kill for a living, operating with discipline and tactical sophistication that made them nearly impossible to catch. Kellerman had learned his trade under Quantrill and Anderson during the war, absorbing lessons about raid tactics, rapid movement, and the psychological impact of overwhelming violence. After Appomattox, he'd simply continued applying those lessons, gathering men who shared his refusal to accept defeat or submit to what he called the tyranny of Reconstruction. The gang operated across a vast territory, striking towns and ranches with careful planning and brutal efficiency before vanishing into wilderness that lawmen dared not follow. By the fall of 1873, Kellerman's gang had accumulated wealth that some estimated in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. They'd hit banks, trains, mining operations, and wealthy ranches, taking gold, silver, cash, and anything else of value. But moving that wealth across country controlled by federal marshals and army patrols required careful planning. Kellerman needed a route through terrain where pursuit would be difficult, where his men could move quickly while anyone following would be slowed by difficult conditions. The Black Mountains offered exactly what he needed. The range ran north to south for nearly 100 miles, with only a handful of passes allowing east-west travel. Most were already watched by army patrols, but there was one route that remained relatively unguarded. It ran through a narrow canyon on the eastern slope, a natural corridor that would allow mounted men to move through the mountains without the arduous climbing that other routes required. The problem was that the canyon ran directly through McAllister Ranch property, and Thomas McAllister was not a man who allowed armed outlaws to cross his land unopposed. Thomas had received word about Kellerman's movements from a federal marshal who passed through in early October. The marshal, a capable man named William Foster, had been tracking the gang for months and had good intelligence suggesting they were planning to move east through the Black Mountains. Foster couldn't spare men to guard every possible route, but he'd asked Thomas to keep watch on his property and send word if suspicious activity was spotted. Thomas had agreed, not fully understanding what he was volunteering for. On October 15th, one of the ranch hands spotted movement in the high country north of the main buildings. A group of riders, too many to count at distance, moving south along the ridgeline. Thomas sent Daniel Curtis to investigate, accompanied by a hand named Peter Morrison. They took field glasses and rode carefully into the foothills, staying in cover as they tried to identify the riders. What they saw made Daniel's blood run cold. 60 men, maybe more, riding in organized columns with scouts ranging ahead and flankers protecting their sides. This wasn't a group of drifters or even ordinary outlaws. This was an army, moving with military precision through terrain they'd clearly scouted beforehand. Daniel watched them for nearly an hour, noting their weapons, their horses, and the pack animals loaded with what had to be stolen goods. Then he and Peter rode hard back to the ranch, knowing that something terrible was approaching. Thomas McAllister stood in his ranch yard that evening, listening to Daniel's report while the other hands gathered around. 60 armed men would reach the canyon entrance by tomorrow morning if they maintained their current pace. Once in the canyon, they'd pass directly through ranch property, following a natural route that would take them past the main buildings and out onto the eastern plains beyond. Thomas could let them pass, could keep his men inside, and hope the outlaws would simply move through without causing trouble. But he knew better. Men like that didn't respect property or fear consequences. They would take what they wanted, burn what they didn't, and likely kill anyone who witnessed their passage. Thomas made his decision with the careful deliberation of a man who understood the weight of his choice. He would send most of his hands south with the majority of the cattle and horses, getting them away from danger. But someone had to stay, had to delay the outlaws long enough for word to reach Marshal Foster and for help to arrive. Someone had to hold the line at the canyon entrance, blocking the easiest route through the mountains and forcing Kellerman to choose between fighting through a defended position or taking a more difficult path that would slow his escape. Wade Garrison volunteered immediately when Thomas explained what he needed. The others tried to argue, pointing out that standing against 60 men was suicide, that delaying tactics wouldn't work against that kind of force. But Wade's logic was simple and brutal. Every hour they delayed Kellerman was an hour for the law to close in. Every man the gang lost trying to force the canyon was one less gun in the subsequent pursuit. And if they could hold long enough, if they could make the cost high enough, maybe Kellerman would abandon the canyon route entirely and take his chances in more difficult terrain where Army patrols might catch him. James McCord volunteered next, followed quickly by Miguel Santos. Daniel Curtis was last, not because he hesitated, but because he took time to think through what he was committing to. He was the youngest, with the most life ahead of him, and what Wade was proposing meant probable death for all of them. But Daniel had grown up watching his father give up, had seen what happened when good men decided the fight wasn't worth the cost. He'd sworn never to be that kind of man. So he stepped forward and said simply that he'd ride with the others. Thomas tried to argue, tried to suggest less drastic alternatives, but the 4 men were united in their decision. They understood the mathematics of the situation. 4 men with good rifles and defensible positions could inflict serious casualties on an attacking force, especially one that had to approach through restricted terrain. They might not win, but they could make victory costly enough that Kellerman would reconsider his route. And every hour they held was an hour for help to arrive. The 4 cowboys spent the night of October 15th preparing for what they knew would likely be their last fight. They selected positions at the mouth of the canyon, where rock formations and scattered boulders created natural fortifications. The canyon entrance was perhaps 60 yards wide, with steep walls rising on both sides. Anyone trying to enter would have to pass through that 60-yard gap under fire from defenders holding elevated positions with clear fields of fire. Wade chose the northernmost position, a cluster of boulders that offered excellent cover and commanded the left approach to the canyon. James took the southern position opposite Wade, using a natural rock shelf that provided both protection and height advantage. Miguel positioned himself slightly behind and above Wade's position, where he could cover the northern approach and provide supporting fire. Daniel took the center, finding a depression in the ground that wasn't ideal for cover, but gave him the ability to shift fire to support either flank as needed. They brought ammunition, as much as they could carry from the ranch stores. Each man had his rifle and a pistol, with extra cylinders already loaded for the revolvers, and boxes of cartridges for the long guns. They carried water, dried meat, and hardtack enough for 2 days if they rationed carefully. They brought field glasses for spotting approaching riders and bandages for treating wounds they knew would come. As dawn broke on October 16th, the 4 men settled into their positions and waited. The morning was crisp and clear, with frost silvering the grass and the sun rising red behind the eastern peaks. It was the kind of morning that made a man grateful to be alive, that reminded him why he'd come west to begin with. Wade found himself thinking about home, about Tennessee hills he hadn't seen in 20 years. James thought about his brother, still in Tennessee, and probably wondering whatever became of his wandering sibling. Miguel thought about his mother, aging now in a small village south of the border, who'd blessed him when he left and begged him to come home safely. Daniel thought about his father's grave in Kansas, about promises made over fresh-turned earth. The outlaws appeared around mid-morning, their column visible first as dust on the northern trail, and as individual riders as they drew closer. They moved confidently, showing no concern about potential danger. Why would they? This was empty country, sparsely populated ranch land where resistance was unlikely. They probably expected to ride through unopposed, maybe stopping to take supplies from the ranch before continuing their journey. Clayton Kellerman himself rode near the front of the column, identifiable by the plumed hat and officer's coat he'd worn since his guerrilla days. He sat his horse with the bearing of a military commander, which in his own mind he still was. Around him rode his lieutenants, hard men who'd followed him through 3 years of raids and killing. Behind them came the main body of the gang, 60 armed outlaws who'd grown rich from theft and confident from success. Wade watched them approach through his field glasses, counting men and noting weapons. He saw repeating rifles, modern revolvers, and enough ammunition to fight a sustained engagement. These weren't desperate men making a desperate play. They were professionals operating at the height of their power, confident that nothing in this remote valley could threaten them. When the column reached a point about 200 yards from the canyon entrance, Wade stood up behind his boulder. He held his rifle casually, pointed at the ground, but clearly visible. The gesture was unmistakable. The canyon was defended. The outlaws would not pass unchallenged. Kellerman raised his hand, halting the column. He stared at Wade for a long moment, probably trying to understand what he was seeing. One man blocking the path of 60. It must have seemed absurd, the kind of gesture that could only come from madness or ignorance. Kellerman kneed his horse forward, riding alone toward Wade's position until he was perhaps 100 yards away. Close enough to shout, far enough to retreat if shooting started. The outlaw leader's voice carried clearly in the still air. "You're blocking my path, friend." "That seems unwise." Wade's response was equally clear. "This is private property. You're not welcome here." Kellerman laughed, a sound without humor. "I don't recall asking permission. Now, I'll give you a chance to reconsider your position. Ride away now, and you'll live to see tomorrow." "Can't do that," Wade replied. "This land belongs to Thomas McAllister, and he doesn't allow armed gangs to cross his property." For the first time, Kellerman seemed to realize this wasn't a lone cowboy making a futile gesture. He studied the canyon entrance more carefully, noting the other positions where the remaining defenders had to be hiding. "How many men do you have?" He called out. "Enough," Wade said simply. It was a bluff, and both men knew it. But Kellerman couldn't know how thin that enough actually was. He might be facing a dozen men, or 20, or just a handful. The only way to find out was to attack, and attacks against prepared positions came with costs, even when you had overwhelming numbers. "I'm going to make you an offer," Kellerman said. His voice had lost its casual tone, becoming businesslike. "You and whoever's with you can ride out now. Take your horses, take your guns, go wherever you want. I won't pursue, won't harm you, won't even remember your names. But if you're still here in 5 minutes, I'll kill every one of you and burn whatever you're trying to protect." Wade didn't need 5 minutes. "We're staying." Kellerman's expression hardened. "Then you're dead men." He wheeled his horse and rode back to his column. Wade watched him gather his lieutenants, watched them point toward the canyon entrance, and gesture to different parts of their force. They were planning their assault, deciding how many men to commit and which approach to take. Wade settled back behind his boulder and called out to the others. "They're coming. Make every shot count." The first attack came 15 minutes later. Kellerman sent 20 men forward in a skirmish line, spreading out as they approached the canyon entrance. They advanced on foot, using available cover, firing as they moved. It was a probing attack, designed to identify defensive positions and test the defenders' resolve. The outlaws moved well, showing military training in their coordination and fire discipline. Wade led them close to within 100 yards before opening fire. His first shot dropped the lead man, a tall outlaw with a red bandana who'd been moving between boulders. James fired from the southern position, hitting another man in the shoulder and spinning him around. Miguel's rifle spoke twice in quick succession, and 2 more outlaws went down. Daniel fired at movement between rocks, his bullet sparking off stone but forcing men to keep their heads down. The attacking outlaws returned fire, their bullets whining off the defenders' rocks and throwing up chips of stone. But they were firing at prepared positions from exposed ground, and the mathematics of the engagement favored the defenders. Wade worked his rifle's lever action smoothly, firing, reloading, acquiring new targets with the mechanical efficiency of long practice. Beside him, Miguel was doing the same, his accuracy making every shot meaningful. The attack lasted perhaps 5 minutes before the outlaws pulled back, dragging their wounded with them. They'd lost 4 men dead and at least 3 more wounded seriously enough to take them out of the fight. The defenders were unscathed, protected by rock and elevation from the outlaws' return fire. From his position 200 yards back, Kellerman watched his men retreat and recalculated his options. 7 casualties to learn what he could have guessed without attacking. The canyon was defended by men who knew how to shoot, who had good positions, and who weren't going to run just because they were outnumbered. This wasn't going to be the easy passage he'd anticipated. The second attack came an hour later, and this time Kellerman committed 40 men. He split them into 2 groups, sending one against the northern side of the canyon entrance and one against the southern. It was a classic flanking maneuver, designed to force the defenders to split their fire and prevent mutual support. The outlaws advanced more carefully this time, using every scrap of cover and laying down suppressing fire to keep the defenders' heads down. Wade and Miguel focused on the northern attack, while James dealt with the southern threat. Daniel shifted position, moving to support whichever side needed help. The volume of fire was immense, a continuous roar of rifles that echoed off the canyon walls and filled the air with powder smoke. Bullets spanged off rocks, whined through the air, kicked up dirt around the defenders' positions. But the defenders held. Wade dropped 3 men before the northern attack stalled, his shots placed with the precision of a man who'd been shooting all his life. Miguel's accuracy was devastating, his bullets finding targets that other men would have considered impossible. On the southern side, James was holding his own, his steady fire forcing the attackers to stay behind cover or risk being hit. Daniel found himself in the worst position, caught in the crossfire between the 2 attacking groups. A bullet clipped the edge of his shelter, showering him with rock fragments. Another bullet burned across his upper arm, drawing blood but missing bone. He ignored the pain and kept firing, knowing that if he stopped, if he gave the attackers any opening, they'd pour through and overrun all the positions. The second attack lasted nearly 20 minutes before Kellerman pulled his men back again. This time the outlaws left 9 dead behind and carried away at least a dozen wounded. The defenders had paid a price too. Daniel's arm wound was bleeding steadily, and James had taken a graze across his ribs that hurt like hell but wasn't deep enough to be serious. Miguel's shelter had been shot to pieces, forcing him to relocate to a less advantageous position. Wade's rifle was so hot he could barely hold it. As the sun climbed toward noon, both sides took stock of the situation. Kellerman had lost 16 men dead and perhaps 20 more wounded badly enough to affect their fighting ability. He'd cut his effective force nearly in half, trying to dislodge 4 men from a naturally strong position. The canyon entrance remained blocked, and his men were growing reluctant to charge into those murderous fields of fire again. But the defenders' situation was equally grim. They'd expended perhaps a third of their ammunition, and at this rate, they'd run dry before nightfall. Daniel's wound needed proper treatment before infection set in. Miguel's repositioning had cost them 1 strong firing point. And most critically, they were exhausted. The combination of fear, adrenaline, and constant shooting had drained them physically and mentally. During the midday lull, Wade called out to the others, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "How's everyone holding?" "Arms bleeding pretty good," Daniel replied. "But I can still shoot." "Took one across the ribs," James added. "More annoying than dangerous." "I'm fine," Miguel said. "But I'm down to maybe 60 rounds. Wade did the math in his head. 60 rounds for Miguel, probably similar amounts for the others. Say 250 rounds total for the 4 of them, against nearly 40 remaining outlaws who could sustain fire indefinitely from their reserves. The mathematics were clear. They couldn't win this fight. The best they could hope for was to hold long enough for help to arrive, assuming help was coming at all. "Marshal Foster knows we're here," Wade said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. "We just have to hold until he shows up." The afternoon brought a change in tactics. Kellerman had learned that direct assault was too costly, so he tried something different. He sent small groups of men to probe different parts of the canyon entrance, looking for weak spots or unguarded approaches. When they found none, he tried long-range fire, keeping the defenders pinned down while he moved men into better positions. The defenders adapted, conserving ammunition by taking only shots they were confident would hit. Miguel became the primary shooter, using his superior marksmanship to punish any outlaw who exposed himself. Wade and James focused on spotting targets and calling out positions, while Daniel provided supporting fire when needed. It was exhausting work, requiring constant vigilance and iron discipline. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Kellerman tried one more major assault. He committed every man he had left, perhaps 35 outlaws rushing the canyon entrance from 3 directions simultaneously. The defenders' fire was devastating, dropping men with almost every shot, but there were simply too many targets. The outlaws reached within 50 yards of the defensive positions before the withering fire forced them back. This attack cost Kellerman another 8 men dead and countless wounded. But it also revealed something critical. The defenders were running low on ammunition. Their rate of fire had slowed noticeably, and they were taking longer to find targets. Kellerman realized that if he launched one more attack, one final overwhelming push, the defenders would run out of bullets before they could stop his men from overrunning their positions. As twilight settled over the Black Mountains, both sides prepared for what everyone knew would be the final engagement. The defenders had perhaps 30 rounds left among them, enough for one more fight if they made every shot perfect. The outlaws still numbered around 30, tired and demoralized, but under the iron command of a leader who wouldn't accept defeat. Wade gathered the others for a quick conference as darkness gathered. "They're going to come at full dark," he said. "One more rush with everything they have. We won't have enough ammunition to stop them." "Then what do we do?" Daniel asked. Wade was quiet for a moment, staring at the gathering shadows. "We hold as long as we can. When the ammunition runs out, we use our pistols. When the pistols are empty, we use knives. We don't surrender, don't run, don't give up. We make them pay for every inch. It was a death sentence, and all 4 men knew it. But no one suggested alternatives. They'd committed to this course when they'd taken these positions at dawn. They'd held the line all day, cost Kellerman nearly half his force, and bought time for help that might or might not arrive. If this was where their story ended, at least it would end with them standing their ground. The attack came just as full darkness settled. Kellerman sent his remaining men forward in one final desperate charge, 30 outlaws rushing through the darkness toward positions they could barely see. The defenders opened fire, their muzzle flashes bright in the night. Men fell, screaming, as bullets found them in the darkness. But still they came, driven by their leader's will and their own desperation. Wade fired his last rifle round, dropped the weapon, and drew his pistol. Beside him, Miguel was doing the same. James's rifle clicked empty on the southern position. Daniel was down to his last few cartridges, firing them carefully at targets he could barely distinguish in the darkness. The outlaws reached 30 yards from the positions, then 20. Wade could see individual faces in the darkness, could hear their labored breathing as they climbed toward him. He fired his pistol, saw a man fall, fired again at another shape. His hammer fell on an empty chamber. He drew his knife. And then, from the darkness behind the outlaws, came a sound that changed everything. A bugle call, clear and bright in the night air, followed by the thunder of hooves and the distinctive crack of army carbines. Marshal Foster had arrived with a cavalry troop, 20 mounted soldiers who'd ridden hard from the territorial capital after receiving word of the outlaws' movements. The effect on the attacking outlaws was instantaneous. Men who'd been climbing toward the defenders suddenly found themselves caught between 2 fires, with cavalry charging their rear and defenders still shooting from in front. The formation disintegrated as outlaws broke and ran, seeking escape in the darkness. Some made it. Many didn't. Clayton Kellerman himself was cut down trying to rally his men, shot from his horse by a cavalry trooper who'd been hunting him for 3 years. When dawn broke on October 17th, the Battle of Black Mountain Canyon was over. 23 outlaws lay dead in the approaches to the canyon entrance. Another 15 were captured wounded or trying to flee. Clayton Kellerman's gang, one of the most feared outlaw organizations on the frontier, had been destroyed in less than 24 hours of fighting. The 4 defenders emerged from their positions as the sun rose, exhausted, wounded, and barely able to stand. They'd held the line against an army for nearly 15 hours, fought off 4 major attacks and countless smaller probes, and inflicted casualties that military tacticians would later describe as remarkable given the disparity of forces. Marshal Foster found them sitting on the rocks they'd defended, too tired to move, passing around a canteen of water. He stood looking at the 4 men for a long moment before speaking. "Thomas McAllister sent word you were planning something stupid," he said finally. "I'm glad we got here in time." "So are we," Wade replied quietly. The story of the 4 cowboys who held Black Mountain Canyon spread rapidly across the frontier. Newspapers carried accounts that grew more elaborate with each retelling. Military officers studied the tactical aspects of the defense, marveling at how 4 men had inflicted such devastating casualties on a much larger force. Veterans of frontier warfare nodded knowingly and said they weren't surprised. Good men with good rifles and strong positions could work miracles if they were desperate enough and brave enough to stand their ground. But for the 4 men themselves, the battle became something they rarely spoke about. Wade Garrison continued working for Thomas McAllister until his retirement 15 years later. James McCord stayed on the ranch too, eventually becoming foreman. Miguel Santos used the reward money from Kellerman's capture to bring his mother north, settling her in a small house near the ranch where she lived out her days. Daniel Curtis, the youngest, carried the scar from his arm wound for the rest of his life. A thin white line that he said reminded him what courage looked like. They were 4 ordinary men who'd done something extraordinary, not because they sought glory or wanted to be heroes, but because they understood that some things were worth fighting for, worth dying for if necessary. They'd held the line when any reasonable person would have run. They'd stood against an army when any sane person would have surrendered. And in doing so, they'd proven something that the frontier needed proven again and again. That courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act rightly despite that fear. The Black Mountains still stand, their dark pine forests covering peaks that have witnessed countless human dramas over the centuries. The canyon where 4 men held an army remains mostly unchanged, the rocks bearing scars from bullets fired that October day in 1873. Visitors sometimes stand at the canyon entrance and try to imagine what it must have been like. 4 men against 60, knowing that survival was unlikely, but fighting anyway because it was the right thing to do. The lesson of Black Mountain Canyon echoes across the years. It speaks to anyone who's ever faced overwhelming odds, anyone who's been told that resistance is futile, anyone who's wondered whether one person can make a difference against forces that seem unstoppable. The answer, written in blood and courage on those canyon rocks, is simple and absolute. Stand your ground. Make them pay for every inch. Hold the line. And sometimes, if you're brave enough and stubborn enough, help will arrive just when you need it most. If you enjoyed this story from the frontier, where ordinary men did extraordinary things simply because it needed doing, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. These tales of courage, determination, and the raw human spirit that built the American West deserve to be remembered and shared. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts on the story, and consider clicking the notification bell so you never miss another tale from those hard days, when the frontier was still wild and men proved their worth through deeds rather than words. Your support helps keep these stories alive, ensuring that the courage of men like Wade, James, Miguel, and Daniel continues to inspire new generations.